The GH5s is one of the crown achievements of Micro Four Thirds, but I really love the GH6 as well. And you know, a lot of people really compare these cameras a lot. And you know, in fact, I always think back to one comment on my channel which said, why bother with the GH6? Just get a GH5s. And while the GH5s is great, can it really hold a candle to the latest and greatest that Panasonic has to offer? Well, we're gonna test a bunch of stuff. Like, obviously these are very different cameras. We've got a fixed 10 megapixel sensor versus like a stabilized 25 megapixel sensor with 4K 60, 120, 5.7K, 5.8K. Well, this just does 4K. So, you know, when it comes to resolution, frame rates, and a couple of the modern features, obviously the GH6 here is gonna take the cake. But when it comes to pure image quality, the image in general, like the dynamic range, the noise, the color, is this the superior camera, or is it still good enough compared to our friend, the GH6 here? So we're gonna skip a lot of the basic stuff like autofocus and the basic info and just dive right into the raw image quality between these two cameras. Let's do it. So going right into the sharpness, it's not my favorite measurement just because who really cares about like peak sharpness, but I figured for the sake of completion, it's probably important. So I went into Vlog, turned all the settings as far down as they would go, and tested this out because, you know, Vlog's the most organic, natural, least digitally altered image you can get outside of like RAW. So let's check it out. First of all, I had a bit of a conflict here because the GH6 can do a higher resolution, of course, but it also has a really high all-intra 4K mode. So let's look at that first. So all-eye 4K on the GH6 is ridiculously sharp, super detailed, and has especially more color information if you really wanted to push this image because it's 422 10-bit instead of 420 like in the 5.7K mode. Speaking of, I do think there's a little bit less weird artifacting and digital stuff going on at 5.7K. The image looks both more detailed and a little bit more organic at the same time. So there's that. But honestly, these two resolutions, it's pretty difficult to see a difference even at like 400, 600%. Moving on to the GH5s here, it's shooting 4K all eye, and you know, the difference is not as big as I thought it might be. I'm really struggling to find a difference between the 4K of the GH5s, the 4K of the GH6, and even the 5.7K of the GH6. Okay, if you're gonna like super hyper pixel peep down to the tiniest level, look at every little inch of this image, I think the GH6 is sharper in 4K, it's sharper in 5.7K. I mean, look at this part right here. Those lines kind of are all distinct on the GH6, and on the GH5s, they do sort of converge and blur out. So is this just an older sensor? Is this a lower megapixel? Is this the optical low pass filter, which I believe is in the GH5s? There's some conflicting reports online. But point is, if I have to pick, the GH6 is the winner here. But man, is it super, 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 super close in terms of resolution, even when looking at like 5.7K versus 4K. The difference is not there. So if you're looking at just pure image quality, I'd say resolution, it goes to the GH6, but it's very close. Okay, so with the GH6 taking one, I wanted to put the GH5s against something that it could probably win pretty easily, in my opinion, which is the noise test. So we got my color chart out, we exposed perfectly, and I used Neat Video's noise reduction selector to tell me exactly how noisy the images were. And again, this is all Vlog with all the settings turned all the way down. So let's start with the GH6 since it's the newer camera. So if we're looking at the base ISO of 250 in Vlog, we get a noise rating of 3. Okay, good base. If we bump up to 2000 ISO, my findings from previous videos is true, which is that it's really is a little bit noisier in those really deep shadows, and we're getting a noise rating of 4 at 2000 ISO. Climbing up to 12,800, we're getting a noise reading of 9.8, which is pretty fair because that's a pretty high ISO for a crop sensor camera. So onto the GH5s with its dual gain sensor. It's slightly bigger sensor as well. We actually get a lower noise reading at 400 at 2.5 versus the GH6's 3.0. So camera's off to a very good start. Next up, we bumped the camera up to 2500, which is the second native ISO, at least in my opinion. Comment down below if you disagree. And we get a noise reading of 3.2, so not much higher than the base ISO, as well as being a little bit better than the 4.0 reading of the GH6 at 2000 ISO. Here's where the camera starts to really pull ahead, which is at the 12,800 ISO, which gives us a reading of 4.4, which is just a little higher than actually 2000 ISO on the GH6. So you might be thinking that I knew the GH5s was better in low light than the GH6. It's got a bigger sensor, dual gain, and it's kind of its main thing, right? But how is it this much better? Well, I think there's definitely, if you look at the noise and the actual quality of the noise and the image, there's definitely a lot of noise reduction going on in the GH5s compared to the GH6. Just generally, the noise on the GH6 is less altered in the sort of vlog. So it's unclear how much noise reduction is helping the GH5s right now. I would say the GH5s is still going to win this pretty easily, noise reduction or no, just because of physics. It's got two things in its favor compared to the GH6. But yeah, I don't think it's as good as these tests may, hint at, but it is very good regardless. So effectively, it beats the GH6. In reality, it's going to beat the GH6. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. The GH5s is a better low light camera than the GH6, but not by as much as you would think. And keep in mind that noise reduction is gonna mess with the image and give it a little bit of an unfair advantage. I'm gonna get my color chart out. I'm going to gradually increase the exposure by 1/3 of a stop and find out when the image breaks in the highlights. Let's just stick with our highlight information and see how far we can push these cameras when it comes to overexposing. I don't want to just see who wins and which camera is better than the other, but I want to give you guys the information to know and when to expect these cameras to break when it comes to overexposing and how far you can pull this stuff back and how far you can push these cameras. So let's check out the GH5s first because it's a little bit more straightforward. So obviously 400 ISO looks perfect. It's perfectly exposed and the results are great. Going one stop over and adjusted back down looks perfect as well. 2 stops over looks really good, but if you look closely, it's starting to break up a little bit. And then up to 3 stops and it's totally gone. Skin tones are breaking and the chart is pretty much there's not much info recoverable at this point. If you roll it back a little bit, and I would say between 2 1/3 and 2 2/3 overexposed is where it's gonna break. So, I mean, if I was being a little bit harsh, I'd call it 2 1/3. But I'm going to call it 2.5, I think. So just for completionist's sake, I bumped up to 2500 ISO and tested the dynamic range there as well, just because I wanted to. Again, 1 stop overexposed is fine. Same for 2 stops. And 3 stops is broken again, but you only have to roll it back to 2 2/3 over to find our breaking point. So yeah, I would say that the high ISO value of the GH5s actually has a little bit more highlight detail. Is it like 1/3 of a stop? Is it like even less? It's very small, but in this test at least, 2500 ISO had a little bit better dynamic range than 400, but still both of them are breaking somewhere between 2 and 3 stops overexposed. So I'm going to do the low ISO on the GH6, and the first thing we're going to confirm is, does the GH5s beat the GH6 at the low ISOs? We all know 2000 ISO DR boost on is going to be really, really good, but can it beat the GH6 at the low 250 ISO? So starting at 0 and then 1 stop over, GH6 at 250 looks pretty good. 2 stops over is not bad, but if you look really closely, there's some barely noticeable little things here and there. And 3 stops is, yeah, the skin tones are gone. And if you push it up to 4 even, it's a complete mess. So Let's roll it back and see what our exact breaking point is. So it looks to me like 2 1/3 stops overexposed is where our camera tops out. So this is essentially the same as the GH5s, but it topped out at 2.5 or 2 2/3 of a stop, while the GH6 is 2 1/3 of a stop. So I guess this is a little win for the GH5s, having better dynamic range at those low values. Can the GH5s beat dynamic range boost on? Because if that's the case, I will completely admit that the GH5s is a superior camera when it comes to dynamic range, at least. So put your bets in now. Is there any way that the GH5s can beat the GH6 with dynamic range boost on? Let's find out. So we set it to 2000 ISO, we turned dynamic range boost on, and look at this. 1 stop looks good. 2 stops over looks great as well. There's really none of those little artifacts and things I noticed with DR boost off, or even with the GH5s at 2 stops. We push it to 3 stops, and okay, well, it's already beaten the GH5s. 3 stops looks amazing, and I really don't see any image degradation, any colors being lost, any highlights being clipped just yet. Really, really impressive. Bump up to 4 stops, however, and we're definitely losing our highlights and skin tones, and of course 5 stops looks even worse. And yes, when we roll it back, 4 stops is pretty much the breaking point. I'd say that 3 2/3 of a stop is really pushing it, but you should be okay with your skin tones and things like that. And this is proving that yes, even the GH5s, a camera that is pretty solid in its dynamic range, the GH6 has a full stop in the highlights of dynamic range past what the GH5s can do. So yeah, it's good to know that that works as intended, and I think that's really impressive. GH5s breaks at 3 stops, GH6 breaks at 4 stops. That's a whole stop for me. So this one, I think, you know, I almost want to give a point each because the GH5s does beat the GH6 at the low ISOs, but overall, in ideal circumstances, you know, when you've got indie and can control your environment and all that sort of thing, the GH6 does win if you know how to use it to its full potential. So I'll give a half point to the GH5s, and I'll give a full point to the GH6. You might have noticed this already, by the way, looking at this test, but when we talk about skin tones, the GH5s definitely had really good color science when it came out. I remember people talking about it and being really impressed because the GH5 had a little bit of the green kind of vibes, which never was, no, you never want to be turning green in your videos. It's not ideal. So the GH5s came in with what I thought was a really nice skin tone, had a little bit of that magenta cast, but you know, it was still a big improvement. Now, in my opinion, the GH6 is a big improvement again, really bringing those magentas back into a warmer kind of tone. This means those cameras are going to be kind of hard to match if you use them together because the skin tones on the GH6 are, in my opinion, it's just, you know, let's just give the GH6 the point right away. As far as existing cameras that I've used, GH6 is pretty much the best Panasonic has to offer when it comes to those skin tones and colors. I wanted to test a few more things out for you guys, like some of the higher frame rates, some of like a little bit of 1080p footage, and a few things like that. So first off, let's go into high frame rates. So this is a bit of an unfair comparison, but you know, the GH6 is an unfair camera to put the GH5s against in favorable and unfavorable ways. And unfortunately, the GH5s, it's capping out at 4K 60 8-bit. I shot this in Vlog just to show the difference, and you do see a little bit of softness, a little bit of color issues and things along those lines. It's not bad, and if you really nail the exposure, you can definitely use 4K 60 in this camera, even in Vlog, but it's not ideal, especially when compared to the GH6 shooting 4K 120, and this camera reads out natively at 120 frames a second, so your 4K 24 and your 4K 120 is looking pretty much identical. So when it comes to the high frame rate shooting in 4K, GH6 shooting at 4K 120 10-bit versus 4K 60 8-bit, it's really not a competition. GH6 is winning this one hands down. But both these cameras can do 240 frames a second. Well, the GH6 can do 300, but I'm too stupid to figure out the math, so let's compare. So if we look at the GH5s, The 240 has a crop. It's got a ton of aliasing. It's got some weird colors going on. I shot this in natural just to not completely destroy it, but yeah, the aliasing and noise really kind of kills this feature for me. I think 1080p 60 is fine. 1080 120 is okay, but 240 is just, I would say, unusable for most things on the GH5s, unfortunately. The GH6, like I said, could go to 300, but I'm going to keep it at 240 just to keep it even. And yeah, there's still a little bit of color and some weird like digital sharpening happening, but the aliasing is way down. The sharpness is a little bit better, even though the digital sharpness doesn't look too great. And the noise is way better. And I didn't shoot a test of this, but if you push those down to 120, the GH6 is even better, and the GH5s isn't that much different. So just like the 4K high-speed shooting, the sort of 1080p high-speed shooting is not great either. And while we're at 1080p, I did a quick test of our chicken coop here once again, and I'd say the 1080p is actually pretty equivalent on both of these. I think there might be a slight digital edge to the GH5s, where the GH6 looks a little bit more natural in this situation anyway. But to be honest, I couldn't tell that big of a difference. And to quickly touch on the photography, I think you can get actually really great photos of the GH5s. They look super smooth until you try to zoom them in or crop them or print them too big, because we've only got like a 10 megapixel sensor on that camera. Not great for photos, but the 25 megapixel of the GH6 is really, really handy for a little bit of cropping. And I've really fallen in love with the handheld high resolution mode, giving you 100 megapixel images. So yeah, the GH6 is giving you at least 2.5 to 10 times the resolution in terms of stills. So it's pretty obvious who the one's going to, isn't it? So at the end of the day, these are great cameras, and I don't think they occupy the same space. I think these are easily two cameras that, stand on their own. I use them both all the time, and I never use them for the same thing. The GH6 is my handheld, go-to, high frame rate, high resolution, and sometimes hybrid photo camera, whereas the GH6 is on a tripod, getting the slower lenses, but the better low light sensitivity. It's on a tripod, it's a wide shot. If I'm doing like a film, I have the GH6 on my handheld rig, and the GH5s is going to be, in my gimbal or dolly or any other kind of thing where you don't need stabilization as much. So these cameras for me occupy completely different niches, but if you're going to buy a second or a third GH6, I definitely think you may want to consider a GH5s, because there's not that many of these things out there. They still hold a pretty good value, so they're not super cheap, but they're not expensive either. And they definitely do a few things better than the GH6. So I really do love this camera. I think it's got a place in almost anybody who shoots Micro Four Thirds or even the full frame S series cameras. I think there's a good argument that this lens should be in your kit, just as that low light cinematic monster who kills it at 24 and 30 frames a second. But we'll leave the higher frame rates and, better detail and higher resolutions up to its big brother or even its full frame counterparts. So yeah, I don't think this is a replacement for the GH6. I don't think it's better. I don't think it's worse. I think it's a perfect harmony between these two cameras, that they should live together, they should be used together, and I do truly believe that. So anyway, guys, thanks for stopping by, watching this comparison. I was very surprised that no one had done a comparison between these two that I could see, at least not a super detailed one. I think my buddy Shane did a pretty good one, and there might be some extra info. So definitely hopping over to Geeky Nerdy Techie to check out his video. But otherwise, thanks for stopping by, and tell me, which of these cameras do you think is better, just like a full stop, and better for who? I definitely think if you're doing like cinematic stuff, there's an argument to be made the GH5s could just be the better camera in general, but I personally think the GH6 is a better hybrid. But who knows, maybe even the GH Mark II or GH5 Mark II, where the S5 is better. But either way, let me know down in the comments which of these cameras you're using, which you're using more, what you're using them for. Just start a discussion, keep it going, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for stopping by.